Hello and welcome back to the Command & Conquer War Breakdown Series something. This time on MCVs, or Mobile Construction Vehicles. I've already done a series of 2 videos on the MCVs a while back, but alas, it has been so long that I don't really remember what they said, and to be honest, they don't look really all that good, so here I am for round 2. Beyond Tiberium as a resource, what would you say is the most important, most fundamental core concept or thing in the franchise? Not the most important character or the coolest unit, but the most fundamental building block that makes all the rest of the series of games possible. The answer to that is the MCV, the Mobile Construction Vehicle. In the Command & Conquer part of the RTS genre, the games, besides generals of course, although they have a system that is similar to it, rely on the MCV to facilitate every part of combat, and their existence not only allows everything that happens in the game to happen, but also creates a nearly endless list of implications for the world that exists outside of the games directly. What is a MCV exactly for new people? An MCV is an enormous construction yard attached to wheels that drives or is flown across the world onto a battlefield, where it unpacks, builds buildings with material that it derives either from ore or from Tiberium, and allows a small force to be transported with the MCV to threaten enormous areas around the vehicle. One MCV left unchecked could destroy entire enemy bases or wipe out supply lines for entire armies. They represent the single largest threat on the battlefield, even more than Titan walkers and mammoth tanks. In the right hands, an MCV could be used to assault even the most fortified and impregnable defenses, and it is for this reason that they are so often the main target of attack in multiplayer games, and once destroyed, the other player so often gives up. But beyond being just a structure, what is an MCV? How does it work, and what implications does the vehicle have on the world in both game universes? Well, the implications are incredible, as the technology they represent could absolutely transform the world if properly utilized. MCVs have been theorized about for decades now, but the best explanation for how they work in my mind is explained through a mixture of 3D printing and nanotechnology. 3D printing is a form of additive manufacturing, basically the opposite of most conventional manufacturing techniques typically used in factories across the world. When one is making, say, an engine, one usually starts out with a solid block of aluminum or steel or cast iron and begins to cut away at it with machining tools, basically subtracting from the structure of the block until it closely resembles the shape that you're really after. Additive manufacturing works in the opposite way. In 3D printing, most obvious with FDM or fused deposition modeling, as that is the one that most people see most commonly at the moment, material is extruded from a machine and is built on little by little to form a structure out piece by piece, adding material little by little until finished. In FDM printing, a filament composed of thermoplastics is fed through a tube to a print head, which heats the plastic to melting temperature, and that as it melts, melted bits are pushed through and in increments of millimeters at a time form a structure like a miniature for games, or a plastic cast for use in making silicone molds. This is essentially how MCVs do their constructing. Let me explain the life cycle of a base, in order to explain this from the point of view of this explanation. So, the MCV is transported to a base location. First, it finds a suitable location to unpack and does. In-game, this is done immediately, but would most likely be done in phases with the help of other equipment possibly carried on the body of the MCV to dig out below it and to do the other beginning construction parts. Next, the MCV begins to construct a power center. It does this by constructing, when unpacked and ready, using stored materials shown to us in the form of credits, to layer by layer create the components to build the prefab structures that make up the buildings of these bases. This explains why every base building is identical, as it all comes from a few base blueprints. As to how it constructs these parts, It could be done either through conventional 3D manufacturing techniques like laser sintering to build metal parts, or advanced FDM printing for plastic or polymer parts. It could also be done through the use of an advanced technology that is unknown to us for the most part in real life, nanorobotics. Nanotechnology is essentially technology that exists in microscopic scales. Naturally, an organic example of this is a cell in our body, or a virus. Cells, using commands found in DNA, can be programmed to build people or animals when fed the right materials and energy. Nanorobotics, used for construction, would essentially be the same thing, but using tiny robots programmed with the plans for each individual piece of a building or a vehicle. When fed materials derived from tiberium or ore, these robots would construct it using various prefab parts that are needed, which are then assembled on the designated location. There's also the possibility that the MCV doesn't create the structure itself, but instead the mini specialized MCV-like vehicle, which leaves the MCV when finished and unpacks into the power structure later, much like the rig from C&C 3, though this is not something that we see in game. Although, it would be rather like how the Empire of the Rising Sun constructs its buildings using nanotech. In this way, each structure after the MCV is essentially another MCV that does not repack and constructs into a specialized line of products. The barracks constructs armor and guns and houses soldiers, the war factory constructs tanks and bikes, and the airfield orcas and attack helicopters. Continuing the explanation, the power center is built, which provides more power than the MCV can provide on its own. Next is the other most essential structure, the refinery, which contains an initial harvester. It takes raw tiberium or ore and collects it into the refinery or a silo, then processes it as needed to break down the resources into materials that are used to build more structures and produce units like tanks or aircraft or rifles for soldiers. From there, the next few base structures are built in relative short order, though not as fast as seen in game. The speed in which this all happens is important, as well as the construction process happening in the MCVs and various buildings is directly downstream of how quickly things would be produced in the civilian market, which is something we will cover soon. If an entire base can be completed in 10 minutes, then reconstruction from the devastation of the Tiberium Wars would not still be a continuously ongoing project each decade after each war. Each MCV could simply create another one, which creates more, until enough are made to print prefab cities enough to replace all that is lost within a year or two. Now, the process takes longer than what we see in game, but not significantly longer. For an example, printing functional engines for large structures like cars using laser sintering, usually done for prototypes rather than commercial products, can be done in between 24 to 72 hours, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, though that does not include the extra steps afterward, like heat treating parts or other forms of post-processing, which can extend out the time that this takes quite a bit. Assuming that some of this is solved with nanomachines, the process for building a base could be made faster, but the building time for entire structures is likely measured in days, and many hours at least for the smallest of structures. What this means is that battles in Command & Conquer that we usually see finish in at most half an hour will likely take place over many days to possibly months, with much of the initial force provided in initial counters coming from outside the battle area. The siege of Sarajevo, for instance, which took maybe half an hour to an hour in our time, was likely done with massive outside forces being brought in over several days at least, possibly longer, though the battle was shorter than many of the other skirmishes in the war were. MCVs create the material in tandem with the buildings it generates and the ore or tiberium it intakes to create an endless stream of material for war and violence, which makes the games very, very fun, but also creates interesting out-of-game implications for the rest of the world as well. I will outline my ideas in the general sense here, and then in a subsequent video soon, I will do 2 more specific videos for how MCV tech likely affected the development of the worlds in Red Alert or Tiberium Wars. MCV technology is sort of like the development of the Kodiak in GDI's space program. It was a paradigm shift that was completely untouched by in-game lore. Just imagine the productive capacity that peacetime MCVs could unleash on the world. It is pretty unimaginable. The wars in the 2 main franchises of C&C are devastating, touching everywhere. True world wars. Cities are firebombed, shelled by artillery, nuked, and infected with Tiberium. People are used in bioexperiments or turned into cyborgs, and the productive capacity of the world is destroyed again and again every 10 or 20 years. Far more than in the real world wars. Millions to tens of millions of people die, or in the case of the detonation of the liquid Tiberium bomb, likely hundreds of millions of people will die over the course of the series from the effects of war and pollution. Yet, in the next game, we can see a relatively recovered world. A world trapped on the precipice of another global conflict, yes, but a world that is not as completely destroyed as one might think, given the level of destruction of the wars. It took decades upon decades for the world to recover from the war in Europe and Asia in World War I and II. But a big reason why that relatively quick turnaround happened was because North America, where the US was, a big part of the war, was basically untouched by it. And the destruction presented a massive business opportunity for the incredible industry of the United States to produce for. But in every war in C&C, the war happens everywhere, including in the USA. Nukes go off everywhere. Bombings and naval evasions and more happen at each corner of the world, and nearly everything is destroyed or damaged. In Tib's Sun, the oceans and waterways are nearly all corrupted by Tiberium, and one of the most important arteries by which commerce and supplies go everywhere was shut off. No trade, no intercontinental cooperation, no unified building effort, because after the war, one side may have won, but everyone still hates each other. In Red Alert 2, the Allies and Soviets fight over Chicago, and when the Allies take it back, the Soviets detonate an ICBM and completely destroy the city, killing millions of people and poisoning the lands for generations afterward. In doing so, not only did they destroy the location and kill the people, but they also destroyed the productive capacity of a place that was, at the time, growing into one of the most valuable locations in the world by GDP via services, crippling the world economy for generations to come. Everything that needs to be produced or purchased requires capital, that requires something to be intact to trade or to be converted into currency. But without that, without any of that stuff that's been destroyed by the wars, a return on this sort of war for real people would likely take way, way longer. And it's not entirely certain that if a war like in Red Alert or in Tiberium happened, then the world governments could survive that level of destruction. The MCV, in tandem with the resources of ore and Tiberium, gives the world a chance to rebuild quickly by pulling the resources out of the ground in an unprecedented amount with unbelievable ease, making them available for the production of materials for reconstruction in timeframes that would be completely unavailable otherwise. In the real world, it could take years, sometimes as much as a decade, for high-level factories and a supply chain to be spun up and made ready for production. But MCV, as soon as it is built, can produce nearly anything from this miracle materials. One factory that builds more factories that build the world. One of the best ways to visualize the change to the world actually comes from the transition between Tib's Sun to Tib Wars. When in Tib's Sun, we can see how badly the world is damaged from war in Tiberium. And in Tib Wars, at least in the blue zones, most of the architecture is vastly different from how we see it today, and largely uniform, suggesting that everybody is playing off the same playbook in construction, or the same designs are being used everywhere because the production of the world has, by this point, largely been taken over by MCV tech, since so much of the productive capacity of the world has been destroyed by Tiberium and the wars. This is less true in Red Alert, but definitely still a factor, with a large reason behind that being the fact that the ore, the wonder resource, is just metals being pulled from the ground, not toxic crystals that emit deadly radiation that mutate all it touches and poisons the land by killing the microbiomes in it that fuel the circle of life. Another example to show the ubiquitous nature of the production through MCVs is how every unit available in games is identical to every other of its kind. Well, duh, you might think. From the perspective of a game's developer, making a dozen different variants on tanks or rifles or cars would be wasteful. That is correct, but that design choice is both telling and perspective of the world that they created. I went into this in some of my early videos about the Tiberium Universe Wars, perhaps in the State of the World videos, which I want to do more of soon, but in the beginning of the first Tiberium War, this is likely true for Red Alert 1 as well, the GDI was not a single supranational entity. It was instead a group of countries from the UN that pooled resources into creating a much larger military force than what they could do by themselves. Which means that when the war started, while GDI designs were being introduced, they were likely still Bradleys and Abrams and T-72s on the field fighting, as these units are still relevant to the fighting and present useful war-making potential. But by the end of the Tib Wars game, all the nations of the world have been absorbed either into GDI or the warring states of Nod, and with individual governments and centers of manufacturing destroyed, the ubiquitous Predator tank was probably the only medium tank produced anywhere in the world occupied by GDI. MCVs not only enable these wars, but the capacity to recover from the unimaginable destruction that the wars produce. Without them, the First Tiberium War, or Red Alert's Second World War, may have been the last, as the world simply couldn't recover from them, or fight against the sinister creep of Tiberium covering the world in its soft green glow. Coming soon are videos on the MCV's impact on the universe of Red Alert and Tiberium, which I anticipate will be very interesting to talk about and write for. The Tiberium one, depending if I break it up to be between games or all in one, should be pretty interesting, as the Tiberium universe is definitely the more desperate one, and the one where the most dramatic effect of the MCV tech can be felt. The Red Alert games on the MCV's effect will likely be broken down between games because the games introduced MCV so early into the timeline, and so their function and impact will be different on each game or each micro-game universe. Here at the end, I want to thank everyone for watching, and I hope everyone has a great start to the year, and that you have a great 2026. I'm so happy to be making these videos again and being able to interact with you guys in this great community celebrating these greatest of games. Here's to you. Goodbye, and see you again soon.